Philadelphia City Hall is a structure so heavy that its outer walls had to be built up to 22 feet thick to keep the whole thing from sinking into the ground. It was designed to be the tallest occupied building on Earth, crowned with a 27-ton bronze statue of Pennsylvania's founder, William Penn. To create this masterpiece, armies of stonemasons and sculptors labored for nearly 30 years, while the local government poured over $24 million into its construction. But here's the catch. By the time the final stone was laid, in 1901, the world around it had completely changed, and public opinion was anything but welcoming. Skyscraper technology had moved onto steel frames, leaving Philadelphia with an unreinforced structure that quickly became a financial nightmare to maintain. In fact, the City Hall proved to be so problematic that by the mid-20th century, city leaders drew up plans to tear it down completely. And for the most part, everyone was on board with that idea. Well, to be accurate, everyone but the accountants. When they ran the numbers, they discovered something shocking. Destroying 22-foot thick solid walls would cost so much money that it would literally bankrupt the entire city. And so Philadelphia has been stuck with this antiquated city hall ever since. So how did Philadelphia build a stone fortress so large that not even the city itself could afford to destroy it? And what actually sits inside the world's tallest occupied masonry tower? Stay tuned to find out as we explore what's inside Philadelphia's City Hall. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. First, to understand how Philadelphia ended up with this 500-foot City Hall tower in the middle of the downtown grid, we first have to go back to the late 19th century. For context, Philadelphia wasn't just any American city back then. It was the industrial engine for the entire country. Factories were roaring along the Delaware River, railroads were beginning to crisscross the state, and European immigrants were pouring in by the thousands. Between the American Civil War and the turn of the century, the city's population shot up towards a staggering 1 million. Naturally, as the city grew, so did its bureaucracy. Hence, municipal courts, tax collectors, police departments, and city council members were scattered across cramped colonial-era buildings all over town. For example, Independence Hall, the very cradle of American liberty, was being used as a glorified office space, jammed to the brim with clerks and legal archives. It was chaotic and completely unsustainable. Furthermore, leaders felt that Philadelphia didn't just need a new city hall, it needed to make a statement to the world, a monumental symbol of its wealth, power, and industrial might. Initial plans called for building a new civic palace right on Independence Square, but residents rightfully rejected that idea, as it would have required bulldozing historic grounds for modern politics. So city planners turned their eye towards Center Square, a then massive, underutilized 4-acre public plaza originally laid out back in 1682 by the city's founder. And it's here we meet architect John MacArthur Jr. In 1869, MacArthur won a high-profile design competition with an ultra-ambitious Second Empire-style masterpiece. Think sprawling granite facades, ornate rooftops, hundreds of intricate marble sculptures, and of course that soaring central tower that would shatter world height records. It was amazing, but as it turns out, it was also a nightmare waiting to happen. In August of 1871, workers broke ground at Center Square, and the sheer scale of the operation shocked the public. Remember, this was an era before structural steel skyscrapers, so the building's immense weight couldn't be distributed onto an iron frame. Instead, every single pound of the structure had to be supported by pure, unreinforced masonry. That meant that to keep the central tower from collapsing under its own weight, stonemasons had to lay foundation walls of solid granite up to 22 feet thick at the base. And so, armies of laborers carved out and stacked over 88,000 tons of stone, brick by brick, block by block. By 1874, when the 10-ton cornerstone was finally laid, city leaders proudly promised the public that the building would be completed in just a few short years. And it's also interesting to note that inside that cornerstone, officials sealed a copper time capsule containing 48 distinct artifacts, ranging from gold and silver coins to copies of the US Constitution and a piece of the transatlantic telegraph cable, and even a small bottle of water from a local river. This was a proud, confident moment for the city. However, everyone involved really underestimated the scale that they were dealing with. By the time construction finally concluded in 1901, 30 long years after workers first broke ground, the world had passed Philadelphia City right by. Remember, when the architect first drew up his blueprints, something like a 500-foot stone tower was the pinnacle of human engineering. But during the 3 decades of endless delays and skyrocketing budgets, steel frame construction took over the world. This meant that while Philadelphia was stacking granite blocks on top of one another, places like Chicago and New York were erecting sleek steel skyscrapers in a fraction of the time and for a fraction of the cost. When City Hall finally opened as the tallest occupied building on Earth, public reaction was already widely mixed. Indeed, to some, it was a symbol of civic pride, crowned with Alexander Millen Calder's 27-ton bronze statue of William Penn. As to others, it was already looking like a dated blunder. In fact, its statue was already dated by the time the building was finished. It warrants noting that long before William Penn ever reached his 500-foot perch, the statue itself had already become a public sensation right on the ground. Cast at the Iron Works in northeastern Philadelphia, this huge 37-foot statue was completed in 1892, but because the tower's metal framework wasn't ready to receive it yet, workers disassembled the sculpture into dozens of pieces and transported it to the courtyard of City Hall. There, in 1893, the crews reassembled William Penn right on the ground so that the public could view him up close. For over a year, thousands of Philadelphians walked right up to the founder's boots in the middle of a construction site. It wasn't until late 1894 that workers pieced him back together into 14 sections and hauled him up the tower. On Thanksgiving Day, 1894, a derrick crane lifted his head into the air, where a brave worker bolted it to the torso in just 22 minutes. But even then, there were problems. Alexander had designed the statue of Penn to face south so that his face would be lit by sunlight all day long. And yet, the building commission installed him facing northeast towards Penn Treaty Park, leaving the sculptor furious that his masterpiece's face was cast in perpetual shadow. Yet, despite the shadow, William Penn was finally in place. Now, it's also worth noting that Alexander Millen Calder wasn't just a lone craftsman. He was a part of an artistic dynasty that would dominate Philadelphia's visual landscape for 3 entire generations. While the elder Cladders spent over 20 years sculpting the hundreds of fixtures on City Hall, his son, Alexander Sterling Cladder, served as an apprentice right here on the building. And Sterling would go on to carve his own mark into the city, creating the famous figures of the Swan Memorial Fountain at Logan Circle. And then came the grandson, Alexander Sandy Cladder, who completely revolutionized modern art by installing the moving kinetic sculpture, or the mobile. So, in a twist of urban geography, if you stand at City Hall today and look all the way down the Benjamin Franklin Parkway towards the Philadelphia Museum of Art, you are staring down 3 generations of a family timeline. Starting at the base with the grandfather's heavy stone and bronze, moving down the street to the father's flowing fountain, and ending at the museum with the grandson's delicate, floating modern art suspended in midair. Be that as it may, back in 1901, it turned out that the world was already starting to focus on other priorities, and they were not a fan of this building. The new building had many critics from the start. It was an antiquated, overbuilt, dust-collecting monstrosity, a fossil that looked outdated from the day it was finished. Yet, to be fair, those who step inside, even today, realize that this unreinforced building is actually an absolute masterpiece of mechanical and architectural ingenuity. Starting at the very top, over 500 feet in the air, sits the hollow interior of William Penn himself. Technicians actually access his bronze head by climbing a claustrophobic iron ladder inside the body, before stepping through a narrow trap door hidden in the brim of his hat. And in past restorations, workers literally had to lean out of Penn's eye sockets to scrub away decades of grime. Then, just beneath the statue's boots is the open-air observation deck, offering sweeping views down Benjamin Franklin Parkway. Descend further yet, and the structure's design completely shifts. While the lower portions of the tower is still masonry, the top 180 feet consist of a painted cast iron framework. A small glass-walled elevator drops visitors right through this exposed iron skeleton down into the clock room. Here, the 26-foot-tall clock face dwarfs London's Big Ben, and they're guarded at the corners by 3-ton bronze eagles with 12-foot wingspans. Though riding the lift wasn't always smooth. In the early 20th century, the original hydraulic elevator was slow and prone to breakdown. Even after the city modernized the system in the 1930s, blackouts, or power blinks as they were known back then, frequently stranded terrified tourists inside the exposed iron framework, sometimes leaving them suspended hundreds of feet in the air over an empty yawning shaft between the clock room and the observation deck for hours. Now, below the clocks, the iron skeleton gives way to the lower shaft, where red brick walls taper down to an astounding 10 feet of solid thickness. Emerge from the base of that tower, and you'll find yourself in the main building, surrounded by stone engineering marvels. This is where corner staircases can spiral up to 4 stories with no central support pillars. Their granite steps, cantilevered straight out of the masonry walls, appear to float in midair. And as you step out towards the open central courtyard, through the portal archways, you encounter one of the building's coolest acoustic tricks, the whispering arches. And this is pretty interesting. Because of the precision-carved vaults overhead, 2 people standing 50 feet apart, facing opposite corners, can actually whisper into the wall and hear each other perfectly, as if speaking on a modern phone. There's also room 454, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, a chamber framed by ceiling murals depicting the story of justice throughout history. Though perhaps even more incredible is Conservation Hall, a 2-story saloon with a carved fireplace and stained glass windows. Bizarrely, during the mid-20th century, city officials partitioned off this grand space with cheap drywall and drop ceilings to create extra cubicle space, literally hiding one of the most stunning gilded halls in North America behind soulless office drywall for decades before it was finally rediscovered and restored. Passing through the grand arches at street level, the tower plunges deep underground into a subterranean city of its own right. In the basements, original coal chutes, vaulted steam pipe corridors, and massive foundation footings still sit directly alongside modern train concourses. And it's right down here, during the 1920s, that the building's weight actually caused its first major crisis. Story goes, when the city began carving out its subway system, engineers were horrified to realize that active train lines were going to run directly beneath the tower's footprint. Now, to keep the immense weight of this tower from crushing the subway tunnels beneath it, crews had to execute a rather terrifying feat of engineering. In short, they jacked up heavy steel transfer girders deep beneath the sub-basement levels into the bedrock foundation below it. And from here, the problems got worse. By the post-war boom of the 1950s, all the heavy Victorian complexity had reached a breaking point. Across America, urban planners were falling in love with glass, steel, modernism. This is when grand 19th century public buildings across the nation were suddenly viewed as dark, filthy, outdated eyesores. Of course, Philadelphia was no exception, and City Hall was quickly becoming the ultimate financial and logistical nightmare. And it didn't help that the building was notoriously difficult to heat, drafty, caked in decades of coal soot, and bleeding money and endless maintenance bills. And the maintenance wasn't just expensive, it could be downright dangerous. For example, in 1953, a fire broke out right inside the upper clock shaft, sending smoke billowing out the clock faces themselves as firefighters struggled to get their hoses up hundreds of feet of narrow iron stairs. With that in mind, city officials were eager to set up a more modern downtown skyline, and this palace wasn't seen as a historic treasure at all. They felt that it had to go. By the mid-1950s, city officials had already drawn up plans to level the whole 4-acre site. They wanted to replace this Victorian City Hall with a sleek, modern concrete plaza, and finally rid Philadelphia of the money pit. A trend that, like I said before, was happening all over America at the time. And for the most part, the public was on board, though when the accountants and structural engineers got involved, the perspective changed. You see, tearing down a standard building is simple enough, but Philadelphia's City Hall wasn't built like a standard building. Remember, this was 62,000 tons of solid, unreinforced granite and brick, stacked with foundational walls up to 22 feet thick. When demolition crews finally ran the numbers, the estimates came back at an eye-watering $25 million for demolition. To put that into perspective, tearing down the building in the 1950s was going to cost more money than it had taken to build the entire thing over 30 years. The sheer density of the masonry work meant that conventional wrecking balls would barely make a dent, and explosive demolition was completely off the table, unless the city wanted to collapse its own subway lines below. Simply put, according to some estimates, destroying City Hall would have literally bankrupted the city itself. And so, facing financial ruin to clear the rubble, city leaders stepped back. They shelved the wrecking ball and changed their approach. But don't get me wrong, Philadelphia wasn't keeping City Hall out of architectural love. They were keeping it because they quite literally couldn't afford to destroy it. Stuck with their giant, they had no choice but to change tactics. Over the next few decades, the narrative surrounding the building underwent a serious shift. What had once been denounced as an outdated Victorian eyesore slowly began to rightfully emerge as an irreplaceable architectural marvel. Thus, scaffolding went up, specialized restoration crews were brought in, and decades of black coal soot were blasted off the facades, revealing the breathtaking detail of those hundreds of sculptures underneath. By 1976, as the nation celebrated its bicentennial, the building received the ultimate redemption. It was officially designated a National Historic Landmark. Remarkably, Philadelphia had embraced its indestructible monument so completely that city leaders instituted an unwritten rule. Let's call it a gentleman's agreement, stating that no modern skyscraper in Philadelphia would ever be built higher than the tip of William Penn's bronze hat. And for nearly 80 years, things remained that way. And while modern glass towers like One Liberty Plaza eventually broke that ceiling in 1987, apparently sparking a legendary 20-year sports curse in the process, nothing could take away what Philadelphia City Hall had accomplished. Today, in many ways, Philadelphia City Hall sits at the very heart of the city's identity. It's an irreplaceable pop culture icon, seen on screen in films like National Treasure, 12 Monkeys, and Rocky, where Stallone sprinted right through its shadows. It even became the anchor of a legendary local folklore. As I alluded to earlier, when One Liberty Plaza broke the height ceiling in 1987, superstitious locals blamed it for a soul-crushing 20-year sport championship drought, known as the Curse of Billy Penn. It wasn't until 2007, when ironworkers bolted a tiny statue of William to the top beam of the new Comcast Center, that the curse was magically lifted. Indeed, the Phillies won the World Series just 1 year later. And so, as long as we're being superstitious here, I'd also like to explore another fascinating thought experiment. What would happen to this building if humanity suddenly vanished? If an apocalypse struck North America tomorrow, modern glass and steel skyscrapers would likely deteriorate within a few centuries. But Philadelphia City Hall? Well, thanks to its stonework and millions of bricks, it could very well be one of the last things standing in North America, and it would remain there for thousands of years. A thought that, I suppose, brings us full circle. So we'll leave it there for today, but if you'd like to see more episodes like this one, definitely hit that subscribe button or check out our members area, where I'm in the process of uploading hundreds of episodes from our archive. And don't worry, the first month is free, so you could always sign up, binge watch, and then leave. Otherwise, until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.